So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored to be here with you all. Is this not? Thank you. I'm very honored to be here with you all, soaking up all the exchanges that happen at NAJGA conferences. Similar to spending time in nature, my favorite creative font, I find going out into the NAJGA community just really fills my well. So the value then is returned to my clients when I go home and they ask me and they plea with my favorite question to answer. They say, "Can you help me with this mess? I don't have any idea what to do or where to start." My first answer is always, well, it depends. What's going on? There were not one, but two utilities in front of this home. So we have this fabulous house, and then the utilities ended up needing to go in that location. The next constraint on this site was snow removal. This is Plattsburgh, New York area, northern New York, and we get quite an accumulation of snow over the winter, and the clients have a driveway that's it's close to a half-mile long, and when snow is removed on this site, it all ends up accumulating into the site of interest because of the grading and the site layout. Oh, what's happening? Why is that going? Forward. The third constraint, when it rains, it pours. So we have there's a lot of noise behind me, sorry. There's a lot of impervious surface material on this really steeply pitched house roof. So we have all this water that's being accumulated from, why is the slide advancing without me?
It must be on a
Can I not have that? Kind of. I'm not talking at the same pace as my slides want me to, I guess. Good from there? Awesome. Thank you. So we have all this precipitation in the form of water and or snow at any given time of year that is all flowing basically through the client's front yard. And just by having grading and lawn as the solution was not a really beautiful answer to how to solve that problem. So first thing we did was to basically take a walk around the site and take assessment of what the native communities might indicate that we should be doing or looking for help. So this is where Plattsburgh, New York is on the western shore of Lake Champlain. So we have a lot of sedimentary stone as the parent material. This is in the form of shale. So, and you can see, looking up at the house, that just happened again on its own, I think. This time I got it to go on my own. So looking up at the house, you can see the native plant community actually is quite well so the native cedar, Thuya occidentalis, does really well on these shale sites where there's almost, I mean, you can see there's almost no topsoil, let alone any soil material at all. They're very well adapted to being able to grow in these little crevices. the client and I walked further up the site, so this is going up the driveway, and there's a stand of native cedar that has basically just developed through the accumulation of the fallen leaf litter from cedars growing into the crevices of that native shale. And then, of course, there's a few understory items, but not a whole lot. And then at the top of the driveway, across the street, is this beautiful meadow setting. Lake Champlain area has very fertile soils, so we wanted to look at, on this particular site, what's happening in this native plant community. And we have red juniper, cedar, and ash, along with a lot of this is goldenrod that's growing in here. So a very meadow-like material. So the importance of taking a look at all of these different native materials is they give us an idea of what's happening with our native soils and what we have to work with in the first place. And ultimately, we need to know what that parent material is, because we can't ever permanently change that. We can't permanently change what we have to work with on this site. Excuse me. An owner can have a garden and develop it and end up needing to add resources continually in order to amend the site, but that's not really a sustainable solution for the garden or the garden owner. So we're going to quickly just talk about some of those different features and the differences. Like I was talking about soil texture. So we have the native shale on the left, and you can see there's cedars that are really well adapted to growing in that environment, as well as it's mostly just small rooted plants like grasses and herb and forbs. It's typically, when you have shale, you have very small pore spaces, and so there's not a lot of ability to hold nutrients and water, whereas on the right, we have a very sandy site, and these are both extremes of those soil textures, but it really helps to demonstrate. On the sandy site, we have the red pine, which is established, and in sandy sites, the challenge, on one hand, is that in areas where we have a high amount of precipitation, we end up having a lot of leaching of nutrients through that sandy soil, as well as soil just, the nutrients and organic matter tend to leach, whereas in arid environments, we get a lot of evaporation, and that water holding capacity in the first few inches of the soil is vulnerable to being evaporated and lost. So the other thing that we can see by going out into the environment and taking notes of different ecological settings is we can get a cue about soil depth. So this particular site, there's white oak is the brown-leaved material there. So white oaks, with an understanding of root architecture, white oaks have a very deep root that grows in a very kind of a narrow growth pattern, but it's very deep-rooted, and that is for two purposes. One is to be able to sustain the amount of massive above-ground mass that is going to develop from that tree and keep it stable, but also to grow deeply. It will allow the tree to tap into deep reserves of water and nutrients should we get into short-term drought conditions and such. Conversely, we have shallow-rooted plant materials. So here we are up in the alpine environment where the soil is very thin, and between spruce and pine, we see this spruce that's been wind-thrown because it's so shallowly rooted. However, those shallow roots, this is a disadvantage of the shallow roots, is it's not a stable, mature tree. but that widespread allows the tree to be able to gather more nutrients because it's increased its surface area in those soils that are available. And then there are trees that are adapted to almost impossible situations. I don't know what this is, but it is tenacious. So soil nutrient availability is something that can be seen as you go out and explore different environments as well. On the left is a very active soil where we have a lot of organic material there, and water availability. This is a hemlock stand. And between the amount of leaf litter that is falling and being accumulated, and then with the availability of the water, it's being broken down into good organic material being returned to the soil. This is a really productive environment. On the right, we have a sandy environment that has slightly similar trees. There's still pines and some hemlock, but not as much. But we have, you can see that there's less biomass there. There's just a little less going on. So that's an indication of there's just not the nutrient availability. On the right, it tends to be a drier environment. So there's not as much organic matter that's being cycled into that soil. And in that picture, there are sweet fern in the foreground, but I expect that there are blueberries on this site as well, because based on experiencing this ecosystem, those are probably very acidic soils. And organic material and pH tend to be tied together. So just, this is a lot of information, but the point that I want you to get across from this is when we have acidic soils like blueberries and rhododendrons, and we think of those as acid-loving plant materials. And something that I learned that I thought was kind of interesting, and I'm going to pass on, is that it's not necessarily a direct relationship between the plant needing acidic soil as much as it is at different pH levels, there are nutrients that are available to some plants. And so I thought that was really an interesting thing to find out, was that, okay, at acidic condition, there are just some plants that are adapted not to need as many nutrients as the plants that we would typically find in a neutral pH range. And then the same for the alkaline situations. There are some plants that just, they're okay to have those trace element deficiencies. So sometimes we find out what plants are successful by elimination of those plants that are not successful in a situation. So, and speaking of situations where plants are or are not adapted, so there are effects of exposure on plants that it's important to take note of when you're looking at a site for development or improvement. This is another hemlock. I love hemlocks, so we have lots of hemlocks in our show today. But this hemlock tree grows on one of my clients' properties, and every year they are very concerned. They say, oh my gosh, the top of our tree just looks awful, and it looks worse every year. What's going on, and how can I fix it? And I said, don't worry, there's nothing wrong with your tree. Actually, that was a native tree to this site, so it is adapted to the conditions. There's another hemlock that's growing about probably 50 to 100 feet away in the woods on this same site. So the situation why this hemlock that's in the center of that slide, it looks so nice and healthy, and there's lots of foliage, and it's just really doing a great job. There's the whole story. This hemlock that is of concern is being exposed to the winter winds and ice that are being thrown from Lake Champlain. The house is located on a cliff. So there are winds that are whipping right up the cliffside, and they're actually just wind whipping and killing off the tops of the trees. So there's nothing wrong with this tree. In fact, it's surviving. And is this a pointer? Well, the bar on the bottom? Oh, the mouse. Excuse me. Thank you. So the tree is actually growing and developing a new leader over in this area of the tree to adapt to the fact that the central leader is starting to have a difficult time of sustaining itself. So because the tree has grown up taller than the roof of the house, it's now getting the full effect and the brunt of those winds, whereas if the tree had stayed small, the house buffers that wind shear. So it's one of those things that you look at the ecology of the site and you can kind of put together those clues and say, oh, okay, this is what's happening here. This is a hemlock as well. So, so this is a garden hemlock, and I share this because it's one of those things I like to be able to share, like with the client with the previous tree, and the NAJGA community, that hemlock is actually a shearable evergreen plant, which is one of those coveted plants. In my area, we don't have a whole lot of shearable evergreen material. So, so that's one reason that I can tell the client with confidence, no, there's nothing wrong with your tree, it's being wind sheared, but hemlocks can regrow from older material and they can resprout. So it's not a problem to cut into old wood. But this hemlock, because it is being sheared and it's nice and dense and it's got that nice ferny foliage, it shears into an entoke pretty well. So I talked about plants being adapted or not adapted, and we can kind of see the difference between those plants that are adapted to excuse me. You can tell which plants are adapted to a certain environment based on whether they're successful or not. These are very successful plants, and they're getting wind whipped all the time. The rugosa rose on the left, and then the beach plum and the pitch pine on the right, they all have evolved to have very waxy leaves. And actually the pitch pine, it has very dense growth as well. So that dense needle count and those waxy leaves that are so hard, the scientific name is actually Pinus rigida, because those needles are so rigid, they actually really hurt. Versus the hemlock, which has really soft, feathery-like leaves. So there's different things that we can see in our plant material that's in the native environment. These are native conditions to say, okay, the plant palette that we're going to choose for our garden really needs to be of that kind of material. Another adaptation to wind is this little spruce. So we're back in the alpine again. And this little spruce, it also has very compact needle count within a branch, but also the needles are very short. So there's another adaptation along with the waxy layer that they have on their needles. And the spruce is shaped. It gives an indication of the natural wind patterns on this site. So it has character. I just love alpine plants for that. And in fact, it's good to study not only what plants we're going to find in the environment, but also the different shapes and patterns, because then we can take pictures or take sketches and take notes about what we're finding, and then bring them home and plant them in the garden and have these beautiful compositions of, this is a mountain arrangement, and the little spruce that's on the far side of the stone, its name is actually Soft Mountain. And it's got this really gentle curve, and it just really hugs the stone. And I think that's a lot of what we need to try and find in our Japanese garden development, is just bringing home that essence of what we're finding in nature. And it doesn't matter what nature is It can be any environment, but things that we go out and it makes us feel good, whether it's the alpine zone or the beach zone. There's going to be different elements and shapes and patterns that reflect that and make our memory go to those places that we love. So back to our site development. One of the things that we used, and the clients were so wise, I was so happy, when they did the excavation for their home, they actually asked the contractor to stockpile all the material that they removed in order to dig the foundation. So we had all this stockpiled shale, as well as the client was nice enough to allow us to gently harvest stone from the site. So we selectively took stone that we could find and easily reach without tearing up her native woodland and bring that into the garden. So by using native found stone, it's a twofold benefit there. Number one, the environmental impact has already occurred when they did the excavation for the home. So, all right, we've done some really big damages to the site, but we don't have to do it a second time when we go to a quarry or go off-site and harvest stone off-site and then have to truck it in. So there's a lot to the environmental footprint when building a garden that we were able to negate by just using site-specific materials. Also, site-specific materials help to lend an authenticity to this garden that we're building, so that the garden really feels like, oh, it convinces the mind that this could have been a naturally occurring garden. The other material that we used that was site-specific was mulch. The owners were very wise in a second time by retaining the arborist chips that were cut when they cleared some of their lands. So, and that was a recent clearing that had happened. So these are very fresh mulch chips. And Linda Chalker-Scott of Washington State University, she talks a lot about using fresh arborist chips. If you're not familiar with her and you want to know about mulch, she talks a lot about it in ISA publications and in cooperative extension writings, and she actually has a blog about it. But some of the most beneficial parts of having site nutrient chips are that they help to, support the native, the native microbial community. When we have site-specific chips, there are fungi, thank you. There are fungi that release cellulase, and as they are breaking down that cellulose of the wood, they're actually releasing those enzymes that can decrease other bacteria and fungi that would potentially be causing diseases in your plant material. So there's almost like a twofold effect of using the mulch. There's the basic, okay, we're using mulch for several purposes, but we're also gaining the benefit of having those site-specific fungi right there and available for us. And it's funny, these are the kind of pictures that gross my family out, of course. But a lot of times clients will see these things and they'll say, oh, what is that? What's wrong? This is really good, actually. I love to see this kind of growth because that means that nutrients are being returned to the soil by the microscopic activities that are going on that we can't even see. They're returning nutrients and also increasing the organic material that we need in our soils to help support an environment in a natural way. And here's a shot of mycorrhizae. So mulch helps to, there they are. So those little white patches, those are mycorrhizal fungi, and they help to increase the surface area of the roots, the plant rootlets. So by increasing the surface area of the plant roots, that allows our our plants to then be able to reach out and absorb and uptake more nutrients and more water in an easier way. So it's all these little fascinating things that happen in soil that just really can support the garden without having to add a lot of input on our basis, which is just, I just think it's amazing. So our inspiration for how to deal with, we talked about materials that are being site-specific, like the mulch and the stone, but the inspiration for how to deal with all that water actually came from a little more exotic of a place, the arroyo. So this idea of moving water through their site without going to the solution of the original concept that the owner thought was, well, maybe we could do a rain garden. Well, we don't have the depth to bedrock to be able to detain any amount of water. So instead of trying to detain the water, we need to direct it through the site. So, whoa, that ended up way off. Okay. So we ended up using the arroyo concept as, okay, we only need to handle water on this site on a seasonal basis. So this was the worst thing to ever see when you're in the middle of constructing. They had one of those really torrential rainstorms as we were setting stone. However, at the same time, it was actually the most consoling and assuring thing, because this was our stream channel. This was our channel that we were developing. So for the most part, the water was actually going where we wanted to go. So we just needed to keep moving forward. And here's the end effect that you've seen a couple times. But in the end, we had this beautiful garden that it fit it checked a lot of boxes for us. We used, sorry, this screen angle is weird. We used one cedar on the whole site, and cedar is not necessarily one of those plants that people think of as a specimen plant material for, I don't think, anywhere, because it's just it's one of those things that you can find it anywhere. But it really just lent that authenticity and sense of place to the garden. So actually at this point it is now being pruned with a thinness to it, and the top is being rounded out to age it. And then most of the rest of the site is native grasses and wildflowers, partly because this is that area where all that snow gets stockpiled. So, so this is kind of a sustainable thought process in that if we put some beautiful shrubby, woody material there, the potential for it to get damaged and need to be replaced on an annual basis is really high. So a more sustainable plant material in the sense of use is to put something there that, you know, if it gets snow piled on it, it's okay. And if snow is not piled on it, then it's really nice because we have a lot of seeds for native foragers. So it serves that dual purpose of having a native plant material garden and a nature-inspired garden. And then, we have just a few native junipers that are also on site, and those are masking or blocking the view of those utilities that we put in place. So by using landform and the massing of some shearable plant material, that junipers, they don't need any input at all. They're another one of those super hardy plants in our area. We're able to accomplish that task of making things beautiful. And so this is the part that I really love to share about this garden. Am I down to like 0 minutes? All right, well, really quickly to conclude, the clients rearrange their furniture so that they can go out and watch the rain come through their garden. So by using native materials and by using landform, we were able to build the garden up so that the clients can sit inside their home and look outside and enjoy what's happening out there. And they even go out in the rain and take pictures of this watercourse working. They're so excited. It's just like the best when I get pictures from people going out and using their garden and saying, oh yeah, this is great. So having that client and garden builder connection, and then having the client go out and use and photograph and enjoy their garden, and that's one of the most sustainable choices that we can make, is this garden hopefully fits the needs of the garden owner. It's not a high maintenance thing. I mean, this garden, we spend 2 to 3 hours every other week to maintain it on average for the whole gardening season. So the amount of input that the homeowner needs in that respect is an item that I like to consider. I don't want to build a garden that's not user-friendly. But by building these gardens that people enjoy and it really fits their needs and they really get into it and get excited, that means it's going to be around, hopefully, for their whole existence at this home, maybe the next homeowners or the next generation. So there's a level of sustainability in just thinking about not needing to tear out and replace gardens on a regular basis. So, that's the best. When nature moves in and says, yes, you've built a nice home, I'd like to live here. Thank you.
So Innisfree is in New York's Scenic Hudson Valley, and it's a 185-acre site with designed and natural landscapes arranged around a serene glacial lake. The garden's remarkable choreography invites exploration, contemplation, and renewal, making each visit a unique experience. Envisioned as an oasis, as living experiential art, Innisfree encourages visitors to connect deeply with essential qualities of nature and fundamental cultural ideas of peace, awareness, and beauty. This mid-20th century landmark is listed on the National Register of Historic Places for exceptional national significance, and hopefully will soon be designated a National Historic Landmark. Innisfree offers lessons in design thinking that can result in timeless landscapes, innovative yet grounded in history and place, and sustainable construction and maintenance strategies that, while developed in the 1950s and 60s, are utterly timely, aligned with and yet still ahead of today's cutting-edge horticulture and resilient design practices. Next slide. You guys see the next slide? Excellent. Well, Innisfree looks quite different from other gardens being discussed at this conference. The influence of Japan was foundational. Innisfree certainly meets the definition of a Japanese garden Professor Kendall Brown gives in his 2017 book, Visionary Landscapes. Like its kin, Innisfree serves, in Ken's words, as a kind of road home, a way of connecting with idealizations of nature that restore us mentally and physically, a cultural interpretation of nature refined into compelling and inspiring design forms, transportable across time and space. Innisfree is also a decidedly American garden, drawing inspiration from 5 distinct cultures, periods, and ideas: China, Japan, the Romantic era, modernism, and nature and ecology. But even this could be seen as following Japanese dictums. Lester Collins, the modernist landscape architect primarily responsible for Innisfree, was considered by his peers to be one of the greatest, if unsung, landscape architects of the 20th century. As a designer and a teacher, Collins focused on the human experience in landscapes. As a result, some scholars have called his work emotional, while another deemed it nearly perfect early this year in the Wall Street Journal. I think this mind, spirit, body connection to nature is what captivated him about Japanese gardens. They became a personal touchstone during his first extended visit to Japan in 1939 as part of a 2-year trip studying gardens throughout Asia between his undergraduate and graduate studies at Harvard. In a later manuscript, Collins wrote, in 1939, the great garden historians Tsuyoshi Tamura and Osamu Mori began my knowledge of early Japanese gardens. They told him about the Japanese garden building manual, the Sakuteke, and directed him to visit gardens in Japan and Korea that most clearly retained its influence. He also cited art historians Alexander Soper and Langdon Warner as key mentors. In 1953, Collins stepped down as the Dean of Landscape Architecture at Harvard to return to Japan as a Fulbright scholar and further pursue the path that Tamura and Mori set him upon. In addition to studying traditional Japanese garden design and construction, he collaborated with Fuku Ikawa, a scholar of English literature at Kyoto University, on what, to the best of my knowledge, appears to have been the first, if unpublished, English translation of the Sakuteke. Collins felt the primary directive of this Heian period text was to study great gardens and to study nature, but to always build the essence rather than the copy. And that's exactly what he did at Innisfree. Next slide, please. Thanks. So to get to the point of the conference, there's a lot of build up for this. Let's talk about sustainability in a multivalent sense. That is what really defines this garden. Innisfree began as a private estate with the first major phase of construction in 1930. In 1938, during his senior year in college, Collins met the owners, Walter and Marion Beck, and started both a lifelong friendship and involvement in the project. The Becks had no children, so they planned that the garden would open to the public after their deaths with a $1 million endowment and Lester Collins at the helm. When Marion died in 1959, the estate was $200,000 in debt. In today's dollars, that's about $1.8 million in the red. Nevertheless, Collins quietly opened Innisfree as a public garden in May of 1960. Next, please. Fortunately for Innisfree, Collins was a polymath. Although he often spoke of his farmer common sense, it was a radical common sense combined with a scholar's understanding of multiple design traditions, Quaker restraint, and a singular sense of design, resulting in ideas that seem obvious to the rest of us only in hindsight. With virtually no money and no staff, Collins slowly developed and refined the landscape until his death in 1993. Over those 33 years, he more than doubled the size of the garden and created iconic new garden features. Striving, in his words, to both sustain and survive public interest, which I think is what defines sustainability, Collins balanced financially necessary simplification and simplicity with carefully placed moments of surprise and wonder that draw visitors through the garden. Here in Millbrook, Collins drew on art and science to represent nature. This meta-nature, if you will, invites and even facilitates the individual connection to something larger, something intangible. But Collins also worked with this meta-nature, this abstraction of nature, to go back to Ken's terms, in a hands-on, if deeply innovative manner to reduce both garden construction costs and ongoing maintenance. Next slide, please. Okay, so because the talk is short and I gobbled up a lot of times with my operator error, we're going to run quickly through some big ideas. I can certainly email anyone that wants it a kind of cheat sheet, and the pictures are really going to do most of the work. So we'll go through each of these elements of sustainable design at Innisfree, but we don't need to read that list together. So next slide, please. Time, or slow gardening, is really an essential concept at Innisfree. Collins had a deep understanding of the site because he was involved there for so long, and he actually spent half the year living there for the last 10 years of his life. Because funds were always tight, he had to carefully plan and consider every single project. He worked with and celebrated every aspect, from the particular qualities of the native site, the particular way people process their surroundings, and even the financial constraints, which led to powerful innovation. So these, work with what you have, people. So ideas and vision at Innisfree and at other gardens that adopt these practices can take years or even decades to fully emerge. But as a result, everything has a sort of rightness because it's been kind of allowed to gently develop in that way. The plants are growing where they're happy. The designer is able to kind of tweak elements that don't feel quite right. And so here, and I encourage this approach elsewhere, ideas and not construction or maintenance are given the most time and effort. Next slide, please. Site analysis is a key part of that. Okay, guys, I'm sure you all know how to analyze a site. Innisfree is a natural bowl. There's a lake in the middle. It's a glacial landscape, steep, undulating topography, rock outcroppings, mostly wooded, intact native seed bed. So next slide, let's look at it instead of talking about it. So this is pretty much the first view as you walk into the garden and look out over it. Next slide, please. Here's another part of the garden showing just how steep that really is. So we went from sort of the bowl aspect to part that actually feels a bit more like a fjord. Some of the rock outcroppings and the changes in topography that are evidence of the sort of Laurentide ice sheet going through 13,000 years ago. Next slide, please. Collins really focused on the human experience. His undergraduate thesis at Harvard was on the picturesque. And there was this amazing line, the 18th century was when the Englishman learned to feel with his eyes. Well, I think in Japanese gardens and in any place that's really meaningful to us, we are feeling with our eyes. We're looking, and whatever is sort of happening through our senses transports us. And this was something that it wasn't accidental for him. His mantra with his students at Harvard was that it's easy to design a landscape that looks great from an airplane, i.e. plan view, the way most of us design. I want you to think about how it feels to be in that landscape. He actually started a program at Harvard where students had to build small projects so they could feel that transition from paper to real landscape. So they were in tune with that. In some ways, unlike modernism in architecture, modernism in landscape architecture, which was really the moment of, sort of defining moment of Collins' career, focused on landscapes as places for human activity. So certainly places for people, and just a few book titles written by his peers: Landscape for Living, Gardens Are for People, and Gardens Make Me Laugh. Next slide, please. So we're just going to look through some of the, I think, emotional parts of Innisfree. This is Pine Island. Next slide, please. The point early in the morning with incredible mist coming up. The glacial lake is 13,000 years old, kind of a puddle, but it's still over 30 feet deep. So we get that great mist a lot. Next slide, please. But you can see people make themselves right at home. Next. Next. So it's not so precious that people can't make it their own. Next slide, please. The initial inspiration for Lester's clients was a scroll painting at the British Museum of a Tang Dynasty villa garden that belonged to the poet and painter Wang Wei. And it was early enough that form influenced Japanese gardens, also 8th century. But in looking at that scroll, the Becks and Collins identified sort of a placemaking concept, which they called cup gardens. So no one else is ever going to talk about cup gardens when they talk about Chinese gardens or Japanese gardens for that matter. But it's roughly a garden room. It's a lot larger than that here, but it's clearly defined and inwardly focused, that with the idea of bringing your attention to a particular site. Collins wrote about how it was such a flexible and forgiving model. And I think as a gardener, and I'm sure some of you are gardeners, this is a great, there are some nuggets of wisdom here, that because change is inevitable, when you break the landscape down into individual pictures, a tree comes down or something gets much bigger. Lester called it rebalancing the cup garden. So you might take something else away or add something, but you're able to break it down into small enough pieces that it's not overwhelming. For instance, you can imagine at Vaux-le-Vicomte, one of the most famous French Baroque gardens. If they had boxwood blight, they'd be in trouble. There's no garden left. But here it's sort of like bite-sized pieces, kind of like arranging flowers. If you have a mixed bouquet and the first thing goes past, you take those out and you rejigger it and it keeps going. So it's tricky as a preservationist trying to figure out how this works. But as a gardener, this is a concept I love. And he saw that really subjective task of balancing those cup gardens, keeping the design intent alive, even if the specifics of the design change over time. That was the most important thing. Lawn mowing took the most time. So yeah, not very exciting. Well, let's just start looking at some pictures. Next slide, please. So the whole lake the whole of Innisfree actually in this natural bowl is a cup garden, focusing our attention on the lake in the middle. Next, please. Others are much smaller, like this beautiful lip rock waterfall. Next slide, please. The point, you can see how those three rocks define a space, just like those three sort of landforms on the larger scale also define space. So those are cup gardens within cup gardens. Next slide, please. This is an unusual garden at Innisfree, cup garden, because it relies entirely on flowers. And here, these are heirloom daffodils in the blue hour. Innisfree is a very sculptural, mostly green garden. Next slide, please. A tiny cup garden, really something that happened by chance. Next. So Innisfree is, because the topography changes and the paths go everywhere, it's unusual in that you see the same elements over and over from all different perspectives. So in my mind, it's much more like film than still photography. So I think in Japanese gardens, you proceed and there's places where you stop and you look. At Innisfree, it's sort of all changing all the time. So next slide. These are the terraces. The Beck's house was up on top of these originally, but as we go through the next few slides, we can just progress through them fairly quickly. You can see that we're looking at the same elements, but it changes. So next. Yep. So we're looking at there's a gravel in the front. Now we're looking down on one of those terraces into a lotus pool. Next. And here we're looking crossways at those stone walls. I hope, are we on the same? Terrific, there we are. So a lot of the ideas at Innisfree are really basic. But as I said, I think Collins had a radical common sense, because once you hear it, you're like, wow, of course, that makes perfect sense. But I think I'm a pretty pragmatic person and my brain just doesn't work this way. So a lot of the concepts that we'll review, we don't really need to spend a lot of time on them. But if we're talking about human perception, feeling with our eyes, and body awareness as sort of the design building blocks here, these pairings, sort of foil or yin yang or yin yang, by modulating those through the garden, these are free, that Collins really creates a sense of journey. So as you walk around the lake at Innisfree, all of these things change, and it doesn't feel jarring, but in your subconscious, this is how your senses work. So again, it seems pretty obvious, but most of us designers do not think this way and do not think about how we have these really easy, clear sensory concepts that can help us make the garden engaging for people of all ages and from all walks of life. So next slide, please. So here you can see some contrast, smooth curves, rough rocks, clipped trees in the middle, the sort of natural woodland coming over that rock outcropping. Next, please. One section of the garden is more design heavy on the left, and there are more deciduous trees by chance, so more rounded forms. And then the wilder part of the garden includes a stand of white pines and a hemlock wood. So contrasts on a large scale in the garden. Next, please. That gorgeous curving tree is some of the oldest smoke bushes I've seen on the left, and Collins planted columnar maples on the right as a sort of contrast, a foil for those. Next, please. There are intensive, like busy areas with pretty elaborate paths like this. Next, please. And more naturalistic areas with simpler paths. Next, please. So this is probably the most important and complicated part of what I want to talk to you about today. So I wrote some of it down because it doesn't really come across in bullet points. And then we'll look at these ideas together. So some of Collins' most remarkable innovations at Innisfree relate to plant-centric design and are slowly attracting attention from international leaders in the field of ecological planting. Innisfree will be featured in Noel Kingsbury's upcoming book, Wild, The Naturalistic Garden, out in March. Collins created gardens in different ecosystems on site. These gardens, however, are not typical ecological restoration. With a clear design function in mind and a deep understanding of native ecology, he developed precise, if low maintenance intervention in the natural succession process. Now, I will tell you that sounds fancy, but mowing the lawn is an intervention in the succession process. I live in the Northeast. The succession process here is bare earth to woodland and back. So it's this sort of, you get everything's wooded, trees come down or fire, and you start all over again. So by mowing the lawn, we're not allowing the forest to come up. So it was a little more subtle. So by understanding how the succession process worked in each ecosystem, he targeted plant communities that would naturally emerge, that sort of identify that stage in the succession process, because they would perform the design jobs that he wanted. For instance, he wanted to hide the fact that one path came out and you were very close to the lake. So he let a thicket grow up. So it's not ecological restoration, but it is using ecology to drive this garden making process. So in some areas, gardeners plant no plants, only edit for invasive species and continue the scheduled interventions. In others, if nature has a good idea, more of certain plants are added or certain desirable species are actively encouraged. While the specific results will be different, I really believe these concepts can be applied almost anywhere. It's sort of dive deep and understand what you have, understand how change happens there. And if you're patient, you can really work with that. In 2017, Thomas Rayner, the author of Planting in a Post-Wild World, said that planting plant communities is the future of horticulture. So unlike a traditional mixed border where we choose plants that roughly want the same growth, but we're totally infatuated with how this leaf looks with that flower or something like that. But if you're gardeners, you know that very often plants that you put together because they just look so good together, they're not in that sort of micro environment level. They're not getting what they want, and one's always going to be struggling. So this plant community idea, like modeled on nature, is that over time plants self-sow or they spread through rhizomes or whatever, but they'll eventually get to a place that they're getting the exact amount of light and water and nutrients that they need to really flourish. As a result, letting nature do its thing, you get a much more resilient garden. It requires less maintenance because nature's doing a lot of the work and the plants are all healthier. So the future of horticulture in 2017, but we've been doing it since about 1960. In garden areas that were sort of remnant bits of the estate era, and this is something you can do with your gardens at home or the gardens that you manage for others, Collins adopted a Darwinian approach. So plants that would survive with radically less maintenance, we love, and garden plants are allowed to naturalize and native plants move in. So again, you get this rich matrix of healthier, more resilient, less plants that require less maintenance. Okay, sorry, editing versus faffing, limited versus intensive maintenance. That's pretty obvious. A lot of these models that Collins developed are climate change resilient, especially for areas like the Northeast and the upper Midwest, where intense rainfall and extreme drought have become the norm. Collins made free plants by doing some really basic hybridization, like I have a Kleenex in my pocket and this is a successful plant and I'm going to cross it with that successful plant. He called it assisted natural selection. But what he was doing was creating ecotypes of desirable plants. So plants that are particularly well suited at the genetic level to the growing conditions at hand. As a result, we have plants that spread everywhere and grow in the most unlikely places. So let's look at some pictures. Next, please. Yeah, I love this picture. It's harder to see what I want you to see at the very bottom. That's a bog garden, actually, where native members of the hibiscus family, rose mallows, have been encouraged. So they were already there. They grow on the roadsides here, but they're really easy to they have really big seeds, so you can just spread them around, open up some space for them, and they really take over. So slow, minimal maintenance over time, and we get something that July, August, and September has all kinds of pink flowers on it. Next, please. A little blue stem meadow. It's pretty, we don't have to talk about that. Next, please. These are the worst pictures, and I really apologize. And this is one of the most important parts of this concept at Innisfree. So at the top, if you see on the left, it's a higher shrub mass. That's the part where the thicket of shrubs walls the view of the garden. And then literally you take a step and the plants drop down, creating a sort of plinth, a viewing platform that shows you the long view up the lake. And then on the bottom, on the far right, you can see on the inland side. So the left is that middle height layer. And then on the inland side, it's much lower. Collins took one bog, cleared the trees out, and then with every 5 to 7 years, we get into the thicket and we take the largest shrubs and trees out. Every 2 to 3 years, we get into that lower mass and we take the largest shrubs and trees out, but more of them. So more light hits the ground plane. As a result, a completely different plant community exists there. Blueberries, Ilex verticillata, native pitcher plants, all kinds of wonderful stuff. But again, that's the native seed bed. Different things are activated because more light hits the ground plane. On the inland side, we cut that area over once every fall. And as a result, the herbaceous plants, but next please, outcompete all the woody plants. So it starts with all of these ferns and naturalized Japanese primroses, and some of our favorite skunk cabbage. But basically there are 3 completely different sets of plants doing 3 completely different design jobs, and nothing was planted by us. So this is a worthy idea. Next, please. We'll look quickly. The next few slides are the East Rock Garden along the Kuan Yin Path. And this was historically a very labor-intensive garden. And with this different sort of Darwinian approach where we edit instead of fuss over things, and we let garden plants and native plants move around, this is the effect. So next, please. Next, please. The detail of that. Next, please. This is the opposite end of that walk. Also illustrating one of those sort of yin yang concepts where the same walk was sort of narrow and shady, and you can see here we're coming out into the light a little bit. But this, as a result of this unusual maintenance approach, next please, you get things growing where you could never get them to grow if you wanted them to. Lots of self-sowing. Next please. This is a bog garden. This is one of the types of gardens that we have 60 plus years of documentation that these work, and they're beautiful, but it's exactly what at least cities in our part of the world need. We got the wake-up call with Superstorm Sandy when we knew we needed more resilient landscapes that could be both dry or submerged because of our crazy new weather patterns. Next, please. This is the same area a little later in the season. Next, please. Later still. Next, please. These are Primula japonica, the Japanese primroses. These are one of the plant species that Collins wanted more of. So he did a sort of low-tech hybridizing. Next, please. And you can see again that they end up sowing themselves in really beautiful but unlikely spots. Next. Native columbine is another plant that he worked with. So as a result, that also is really everywhere and growing in charming places like Turtle Rock, which is what we're looking at. Again, we didn't plant them there, but they find their way. So free plants, ecotypes. Next, please. Well, I could give a whole lecture about the innovative and sustainable water system here. I'm not going to, but we do not have any wells and we have very limited pumps. So we work with the water we have in the lake and also a reservoir that is up the hill. So once we get water up to that reservoir, which is naturally filling with rainwater, also gravity helps us feed many of our water features. We also use that process to clean the water, filter the water, control algae growth, and also fertilize all the plants. But these water features that we'll look at very quickly are how Collins responded to his fear that the simplification, that less money required, would make the garden boring. So he created a whole array to sort of liven things up. Next. Well, he didn't create the lake. The Laurentide ice sheet did. Next, please. No. So do I have to stop right now or can I just go through the next few slides? No.
Kate,
So I'm just going to keep.
You can go ahead and go through the next few slides. So maybe let me just make a quick announcement because I'd love to take a few more questions for both Nicki and Kate. But if anybody is on the wellness walk with Dr. Seiko Goto, there's going to be a 2:45 and a 3:20. If you're not sure which one you're on, please check the info table. What's different about this walk is that Dr. Seiko Goto is going to do it upstairs in the exhibit hall. If you want to walk with a volunteer, meet the volunteer at the plaque at 2:35, so in about 10 minutes. Otherwise, you can just go ahead and head straight to the exhibit hall. It's the first building you come to when you enter through the front gate. Meet there at 2:45 or 3:20, depending on which walk you're on. Go ahead, Kate.
Okay, next. Which slide are you on? What do you see in the picture? Okay, so that's a different view of the lake. Next, Mist Waterfall. Next, Lip Rock Waterfall. Next, the Yaramizu. This was actually lifted almost directly from Heian period gardens featured in the Sakuteke. Next, Water sculpture visible from many parts of the garden. Next, Buddha cave. Next, fountain jet. So light, let's just look at the slides. When you live somewhere and you work on a project for so many decades, you really get to understand how the place changes through the seasons and through the day even. So Collins was able to really work with those ideas and use, again, another free element, and the way it hits both natural landforms and created features like that curve in the stream, I think are incredibly beautiful. Next, please. Because Innisfree is in a natural bowl, like James Turrell at the Rodin Crater, next please, Collins is able to use the sort of horizon and the way light hits the horizon in that same very dramatic way. Next, sculptural rocks, landforms, and trees. So these are no maintenance, or there are a few trees that we prune once a year, but most of the trees that are really sculptural and really stand out were selected for unusual forms. And so these are great ways to have sustainable landscape elements, because once these items are placed, revealed, or created, they really don't require much work at all. So next, we'll just look at a few rocks. The point, next. Stone Mountain, next. Living rock ledge, next. Yep. Oh, so sorry. So go past there to the rocks, the next picture. 3 rocks. Yep. Next, Stone Mountain. Next, rock ledge that the glaciers put there. Next, you can see some undulating topography here. Next, it's more obvious here with some created berms. Next, here are some of the trees that they grow like that. We never cut them, but they really make an incredible focal point, just like some of those rocks. Let's just skip this part. We can look at the pictures. So varied design and maintenance intensity, we pretty much covered that and all the other things. So next, please. Lovely picture, one of my favorites. You could see that cluster of tightly clipped trees, I think really transforms the picture. Next. Ironically, that oxbow, what Lester Collins called the Armizu, is incredibly graphic and it really stands out, but it requires the least amount of maintenance because there are no plants there. But in contrast to the other more densely planted areas, it really does stand out. Next, please. So Innisfree is an active partnership between humans and nature. It may be looser, even shaggier in places than traditional gardens, but the roots of inspiration are shared. Innisfree embodies the idea of wabi-sabi, celebrating the authentic, imperfect, and unstudied qualities in nature, while providing the deep and restorative connection to nature that Ken Brown identifies as fundamental to Japanese gardens. The quote, compelling and inspiring, end quote, design thinking and management practices here, like Ken's description of Japanese gardens, are transportable across time and space. I believe Innisfree offers a way for the timeless soul of Japanese gardens to inhabit and inform new and resilient designs and continue to delight new visitors, while providing a roadmap for achieving these poetic effects with timely, sustainable practices that responsible global citizens should embrace. Thank you very much, and thank you for tolerating operator error at the beginning. I'm not sure if there's anyone still there, but
Thank you, Kate. Thank you.
if you are and you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So just a reminder, if you're doing the wellness walk with Dr. Seiko Goto at 2:45, you can meet the volunteer here at 2:35 or at 3:10, or be up at the top at 2:45 or 3:20. And feel free, I know it's officially break time, so feel free to grab a snack or a drink. If anybody wants to stay for a minute or two to take a question or two for Kate or Nicki. Yeah, go ahead, Steven.
Oh,
Yeah,
for letting
so
me know.
Steven's question is, at Innisfree, what is the annual attendance?
That's a great question. It's, we had about 25,000 people this year pay for admission. Members can come for free. One of the things we've still never had enough money to do is advertise. So, so our best year ever is probably a lot less than many other gardens, but people do come from all over the world to see it.
Thank you, Kate. Any
Yeah.
other questions for Kate or Nikki? No? Well, thank you both for your presentations. And we'll see you. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Saki Yamada of Utilization Landscape, and although it's really bad that I could only participate online at this year's conference, I'm looking forward to telling you about Japanese law for protection of cultural properties and how gardens are operated under it now. I hope my talk may be some reference to all of your daily garden operations too. So let me begin. Okay. Let me begin with a sample of introduction. I belong to Utilization Landscape, an old garden landscaping company in Kyoto. Our company is also the exclusive garden company for NAJGA Temple. We also provide exclusive garden services for several other temples, like Higashi Honganji and Jishakuin Temple, or 今回光明寺 Temple. And the work that Japanese gardeners do is divided into the two categories: managing old Japanese gardens and building new Japanese gardens. But because gardens are fostered, they cannot be built unless they can be managed too. I think that this way of thinking is typical of Japanese gardening. I myself am not a Japanese gardener. This graph divides our company into 4 broad categories. Here in the garden division are the Japanese gardeners who are directly involved in the gardens and the designers. I belong to the Heritage and Garden Artistry division, which is responsible for garden research and applying that research to education projects and to programs for using gardens. I'm originally from Tokyo, where I worked in film production and public relations. Utilization Landscape has been entrusted by Kyoto Prefecture and Kyoto City with managing 3 garden facilities. Later, I will discuss the example of our operation of Marina. I will now begin my talk. Japan's cultural properties, including historical gardens, are managed under a single law. The origins of this law can help us understand what is meant by place of scenic beauty in Japan. I will explain these origins chronologically. First, Japanese modernization began with the fall of the Tokugawa regime, Tokugawa Bakufu, which lasted for over 250 years. This was in the mid-19th century. The new Meiji government controlled a modern state that possessed military power and was governed by laws, but because modernization occurred so rapidly, there are negative effects too. For example, during the Tokugawa era, Japanese temples enjoyed great power, lots of land, and had their own spheres of economy and culture. The new government saw the temples as a threat and sought to weaken them. The new government took away a large amount of land from temples all over the country, so they would lose their autonomy. As a result, the temples were impoverished and began to sell their treasured possessions overseas. As I am sure you know, many of Japan's treasures traveled overseas during this period. Out of the concern of this outflow of national treasures overseas, the new government passed the law concerning the preservation of decrees in 1871. This was intended not to much to protect these treasures, but to require cooperation in the government's systematic investigation of what treasures existed throughout Japan. Next, the first national treasures were designated in 1897. Then in 1927, treasures other than those owned by temples became eligible for designation. Up until this point, I have discussed only properties that can be sold and moved, but the founding of preservation laws for gardens and landscapes that can be easily sold or monetized is a different story. Around 50 years after the beginning of modernization, people began to worry that the scenery that they had long cherished was being destroyed on a large scale. Railroad track and large factories using electricity increased dramatically. That's why the law of the preservation of historic, scenic, and natural monuments was passed in 1990. In other words, the protection of immovable property starts here. As a result of this context, separate law was passed. Then Japan encountered the giant turning point of World War II. In the post-war period, cultural properties were considered very important as foundation of Japanese identity, upon which to consider what kind of country Japan is and ought to be in the future. Thus, a law was created to protect cultural properties under a single legislative act as things that share a single large ideal. This was created through legislation passed by Japan's Diet members. In the last slide, I mentioned that cultural properties are divided into two categories. Actually, under Japan's law of the protection of cultural properties are treated under the 6 categories shown on this graph. They are very wide-ranging. Intangible properties such as traditional dance, ritual, and craftsmanship, wild animals, temple folding screen paintings, and ancient underground stone chambers are all covered under the same law, under this law. The red part is the large category of monuments. Monuments basically mean things that cannot be separated from their land. They apply to landscapes, animals, and plants, and historical places. Within monuments, there is a smaller category of place of scenic beauty. This is the English translation of the Agency of Cultural Affairs definition of a place of scenic beauty. It's a bit long. What is important here is the observation that place of scenic beauty includes natural objects and humanist objects. Gardens belongs to humanistic objects. Therefore, techniques that tells us how people have interacted with nature are also subject to protection. For your reference, I will introduce the more detailed categories of place of scenic beauty. This is an interesting graph that shows how Japan itself conceives of the beauty of its national land. For example, there are 7 items designated just for scenery where many pines have been planted. Just having cherry blossoms and autumn leaves is not enough. There have to be pines. There are 40 items of seaside scenery, but there are only 2 for river scenery. These items are almost like a miniaturized of the elements of Japanese gardens. Now, let me return to the law of the protection of cultural properties. I said earlier that this law was created to manage several categories of objects under a single big idea. This is the purpose of that law. I will read its first article, Article 1, the law's purpose. This law seeks to, this is Article 1. This law seeks to preserve cultural properties and utilize them so that they assist the cultural improvement of the national nation while also contributing to the progress of world culture. What is most important is that the law says that cultural properties must be both preserved and utilized. That is the law's purpose of protecting Japanese cultural properties. Protection is considered to be achieved only when preservation and utilization have both been accomplished. For 70 years since World War II, there have been many rules created regarding protection, but Japan's cultural properties have been well protected but it's also true that utilization have been left up to each cultural property. The largest reform came in 2019 with the passage of this law. It establishes rules and responsible parties for cultural property utilization too. The rules are the establishment of utilization plan for each region and a plan for each owner based upon the region's plan. The responsible parties are each local government. In other words, directions has been passed from national government to local government. This effort has just begun, so now we must act as we think about how things will develop in the future. So what should be our goal as a people who actually operate gardens that have been designated cultural properties? It is to realize a cycle of utilization and utilization that contributes to preservation. Today, I am addressing gardens that are cultural properties, but I think my discussion can serve as a reference point for gardens and places that aren't cultural properties too. This is because I will discuss how to permanently enhance the value that a place has and secure a more stable number of visitors and supporters. I hope the talk will be of interest to you. Okay. Utilization that contributes to preservation is rather vague, so here are two specific goals. First, deeply communicating the place's value. Second, nurturing repeat visitors. Meridian, the garden I mentioned earlier, is the place where we first use multi-phased approaches to realize these two goals. This is an operation method called magnification of the garden's intrinsic value. This method received a Japanese Institute of Landscape Architecture's 2021 Management Award. This is what Meridian looks like. It is located in the eastern side of the Kyoto Basin, about a 10 minutes walk from Ranzeji Temple. It is a quiet and very private feeling garden that was built as a vacation home for one of the politicians who led Japan's modernization during the Meiji period. Here are some photographs. The gardens that maintains a strong feeling of connection to the Higashiyama Mountains as its borrowed scenery, the stream that feels like a real brook expressing real nature without any formality, the wide open lawn space. These 3 points are the reasons Meridian was designated a place of scenic beauty. By the way, all of the reasons for cultural properties designation are clearly written down so that anyone can read them from website. Meridian is 3,300 square meters and quite new from Nanzenji. And since 2016, we have been responsible for both managing and operating Meridians as Kyoto City's designated managers. But when you look at it, on a national scale, it's a minor spot. If you ask people about their image of Kyoto, I think most people will say Kiyomizu-dera Temple or Heian Shrine. Only true garden fans would say Meridian. More than 1 million people visit Kiyomizu-dera Temple every year, but only 60,000 people visit Marian. That's why it was important that we consistently continue our two goals of utilization that contributes to preservation. First, deeply communicating the place's value. Second, nurturing repeat visitors. By being consistent, we communicated to people the kind of value that Marian has, and thus increased the number of people who visit Marian for its value as a cultural property. There are the results we have achieved since beginning these efforts. 1, visitors increased 25%, to repeat visits within 3 years increased 8%. 3, people who visit in groups of over 180. 4, a flexible response to COVID-19. This is what our revenues were prior to COVID-19, annual operation expenses and entry fee revenues and so on. It's not quite big. It's a rather small place, as you see. Creating people who want to make Marian a destination after learning about its value require doing the 4 following things. 1, verbalizing value. 2, unwavering service and public relations. 3, accurate questionnaires. 4, appropriate personnel structuring. I will explain each of these. First, verbalizing value means verbalizing and sharing what is about Marian that never changes and that only it has. Specifically, it means creating guide training scripts and developing substantial text for pamphlets and websites. By forming a verbalization team, we thoroughly organize all information about Marian's form, past to present, to learn about the previous research on the subject. Next, we created text to share with staff and public relations materials. We unified our language as much as possible. It's important not to be afraid of being too uniform. What's important is that all staff learn to discuss the place value using the same words. Otherwise, people visiting for the first time will receive explanations using different words that won't last in their memories. Encouraging understanding takes time. No matter how unified the language gets, each explainer inevitably creates their own variations, or you can add the variation after the unification. First, the language has to be unified. Marian has the 3 values I discussed earlier. The garden that I discussed earlier, all of staff is able to communicate these values using the same language. Getting people to visit again requires giving them the ability to tell others what they saw. Verbalizing value is extremely important for the operators. Next in importance is to closely match to the content of events and other services to verbalize value. For example, at Marian, we had candlelit tea ceremonies, which is just like how the garden used to be used. We have also designed illuminated nighttime events so that we can explain the kind of space that Marian's original owner was aiming for during the Meiji period more easily than we can in daytime. For visitors today who aren't used to looking at scenery for a long period of time, once a month we hold 10 minutes no performances that suit the season and let people discover how wonderful it is to take your time in situating yourself in the garden. We teach people about how our gardeners nurture a space that have been designed as cultural properties while working alongside them. Next is public relations, which I imagine America has many advanced examples of. The cases I will discuss are aimed at communicating value while also increasing repeat visitors. The point is not so much to get lots of people to come, but rather to increase the number of people who are satisfied with spending more because the value has been conveyed to them better. We conduct these three basic measures: set goals of attaining followers, simply and consistently communicate daily information, advance notice about events, make sure to check achieved numbers periodically. Likewise, questionnaires are also very important for increasing repeat visitors. There are two types of questionnaires that we always conduct. There are questionnaires for people who come to Meridian. In other words, people who have already received our services, and profile surveys we receive through our social media sites and other media about people planning on visiting Meridian. For questionnaires, what's important is that the same number of the same questions are asked each time at a space that we can continue. This makes the difference between this year and last year's meaningful. We can't get accurate data if we take 100 questionnaires this month, but then only 10 questionnaires next month. 5 questionnaires a day is enough, but what's important is keep taking them. This allows us to figure out our visitors' profile, their level of satisfaction, how their awareness changes during their visit, and what sales prices are reasonable. There are 4 questionnaires we give to people who come to Meridian, and 3 online profile surveys that we perform regularly. For example, questionnaires answers shows us things like this. In 2018, more than half of our visitors were over 50 years old. The age groups were heavily unbalanced, so we wanted to increase the number of young visitors to communicate the garden's value more widely. We created a free day once a month for people under 35 years old and held events that were likely to get young people interested in Japanese gardens. As a result, in 2020, more than half of our visitors were in their 40s or younger. By getting a clear result, we were also able to raise staff motivation. Finally, I will discuss personal structuring. To be honest, when operating garden, preservation and utilization conflict with each other. For one person to serve both purposes is difficult. So we divide the roles of that people are in charge of. The department that operates Meridian's facilities handles preservation. The department that does planning and public relations handles utilization. Thus, we clearly divided each role because each role became clear. Cooperation also became easier. Our involvement with outside volunteers also started with communicating Meridian's value. Meridian has 80 volunteers who are required to take around 10 hours of training in the law of the protection of cultural properties and Meridian's value. Afterwards, they take a written test, and only those who get a score of 60 or higher are allowed to volunteer at Meridian. By incorporating this process, we share Meridian's value with others. Volunteers also think independently about what actions to take, and eventually they give their own opinions as citizens about how Meridian should be operated. For Meridian, that's what the goal is: to preserve and utilize a place whose value transcends our contemporary age. We feel have to involve more people from different positions. But this has to be done by sharing basic information. We are training volunteers for that purpose. Put another way, volunteers are repeat visitors who visit the garden at a high level of frequency. The same can be said about the repeat visitors who came to the tea ceremony class that Marian holds twice a week. They learn in a classroom about how to use historical tea houses and Japanese architecture, and then offer space for general visitors by holding a tea ceremony. This is what our volunteer activities looks like. And this is what the training process looks like. Even after training ends, we hold 4 training sessions a year for knowledge sharing. And as you can see, everyone is quite devoted. They are studying about the different kinds of long grass and studying about the characteristic of how Marian's waterfall was created. Volunteers who have finished studying provided nighttime guide tours. They serve cafe menu items connected to Marian's value and provide explanation of them. This is what the tea ceremony class looks like. We don't just learn about tea, we try to experience the changes in the season that the garden shows us from the classroom. This is the candlelit tea ceremony I was discussing earlier. Our tea ceremony students are the ones serving the tea. I think my talk has been a little rushed, so I end here. I hope that the concept of place of scenic beauty as cultural properties of Japan and the examples of Marian's operation will be of some references to you in the future. Thank you very much.
Hey everybody, I'm so glad to be here. I'm going to keep my part super quick because we have a beautiful short video to show you, and then Sandi can actually talk about this project. So in talking about the intention of, we've talked at different events, talking about the intention of the landscape designer and structures, especially historic landscapes. So for us, we did this low-cost, low-tech, high-impact project during the pandemic, and it was our Pebble Beach restoration. Shofuso, as many of you may know, is a 1.2-acre Japanese garden and structure, and it dates back to there was our first Japanese garden in North America was at our site in 1876. So we have archives going back to the 1957-58 garden that was installed. One day Sandi and I were searching through the archives looking for some plans for projects we were doing, and we uncovered a 1957 boulder plan that neither one of us had ever seen. We laid it out. Our landscape designer, Tansai Sano, had put it together, and we saw that there had been an intended Pebble Beach or Suhama plan for an area of our pond near our boat landing. There we go, there's Shofuso, and which just blew our minds. It was kind of an underutilized area that we had never been able to sort out what should happen there. In planting plans, nothing was there, and this was the reason. So as the executive director of Shofuso, one of my main jobs is making sure that I have great staff ready to do the work, and then to raise the money. So I got about $15,000. We expected this to be a fairly low-cost project. I raised about $15,000. The project got postponed a couple of times, and then Sandi was starting to select the materials when March 2020 happened. He had selected the materials, and Philadelphia, like most of all of our cities, were completely shut down. No one looked at the cherry trees that year outside of Shofuso. The park was padlocked. We reached out to Philadelphia Parks and Recreation and got special permission for Sandi and his assistant Luke to work on this project. And we were granted a very, very early exemption for that work to continue. So Sandi and his garden assistant Luke were able to come into West Fairmount Park and Shofuso and use traditional garden building techniques to complete this Pebble Beach and install something that had never been seen before. Ultimately, we were awarded a 2021 Grand Jury Preservation Award from the Preservation Alliance of Greater Philadelphia for this project, which total cost about $20,000. The other awardees were multi-million-dollar restorations and new installations. So we were really proud to have our low-tech but high-impact project land on the laps of Philadelphia's preservation community. There we go, and that's a shot of it, and Sandi's going to show you much more and talk about this much more. So while this project was going on, no one else was there. Sandi shot footage with his cell phone, and with our newly acquired pandemic video editing skills, we internally were able to make a really beautiful 8-minute video, and then Sandi will come and he'll tell you about how it happened.
In the Japanese garden tradition, it is the phenomena of nature that move the hand of the gardener, guide the turns of the branches, and cut the curves of a stream. The gardens themselves can be understood as artful mediations on the familiar scenes of our natural surroundings. Opportunities to borrow from their infinite complexities and translate their views, their moods, their lessons into the humble spaces that we call our own. A single stone may represent a mountain, an expanse of gravel, the sea. The forms these creative interpretations may take are limitless, but it is always from the native landscape that the primary inspiration flows. For the garden-rich city of Kyoto, Japan, where Shofuso's original designer Tanzai Sano called home, local landscape means rolling hills, rocky outcroppings, and lush mossy groves. One feature in particular, the rocky Pebble Beach, plays an important role in many gardens there. Influenced by the real-life banks of the Kamo River and the cliff-laden Japanese coast, they symbolize the departure point for allegorical journeys to distant islands and mythical places beyond our own. Unknown until now, a newly discovered blueprint by Sano himself revealed the intention for Shofuso's garden to feature just such a Pebble Beach right here in Philadelphia, and from here our work began. If one is to pause for long enough, they will see that there is motion in the stillness. Ordinary things reveal their hidden sides, and the garden comes alive in conversation. Stones have been the backbone of the Japanese garden for more than 1,000 years. With their quiet presence, they are the foundation upon which the entire garden rests, and the stage on which the other elements play. Yet steady as they are in a supporting role, they are just as capable when playing the lead. To use them effectively is to be aware of their subtleties, to notice what qualities bring them together and what features stand them apart. Color, texture, contour, pace. Many considerations help select the stones and guide them to their final destinations. If we hope to integrate a 60-year-old sketch into today's living landscape, the process of design must be as fluid and evolving as the garden itself. Each piece should inform the next, like an ongoing conversation between the past and present, what is and what could be. Sano's drawing is the start. It provides the contours and defines what the space is to become. A recurving crescent beach in the classic Araiso or wild rocky coast style. The examples set by Kyoto's masterpieces give us an idea of how these lines on paper might come to life. Studying these gardens and the wild Japanese scenes that inspired them provides the visual language that we must learn to speak in our work. These artistic influences are then adapted to the realities of our present-day garden. How will visitors move through and experience this new feature? How do the key vantage points interact? Eventually, we reach a point in our surveys that resembles completion. Yet in keeping to the traditional way, we must ultimately let nature have the final say. The stones themselves have stories to tell, and they speak to us as they do to one another. Our willingness to listen and follow their lead is what can transform a simple pile of stone into an elegant Suhama Pebble Beach. The methods that we use, and the process of the doing itself, speak directly to what Shofuso represents. Even if the how cannot always be seen, the presence of ongoing, thoughtful care can certainly be felt in a garden spirit. In Japan, this kind of work is traditionally done by hand. A tactile connection directly with the garden's pieces ensures that no detail is overlooked, and every aspect is personally considered. Without a modern crane, or crews of workers dozen strong, a simple collection of tools and some mechanical advantage help us make up the difference. By employing various techniques both old and new, we're able to position our pieces precisely, and move them in the directions they'll need to go. At times, the process is slow. But part of what makes Shofuso special is the cumulative effort itself. Appreciating that multiple generations have poured their hearts and bodies into what we see before us enriches it further, and inspires us to contribute our humble part faithfully, in a way that would make both Sano and future generations proud. With the pond drained and our tools at the ready, the time has come to make our moves and begin reshaping the hidden structures of these banks. Like searching for diamonds in the talus, our building blocks come from the depths of the pond's own history. Stones unearthed from generations past, to be reset and reimagined in new lives above the water surface. This waiting path is not always glamorous, but through patience and focused determination, we keep sight of our goal. Trusting that our tiny steps will accumulate and each piece will fall into its rightful place. Sano's 60-year-old Pebble Beach vision will finally be realized. As we work to find each piece's place amongst the rest, the harmony of their coming together relies on the keenness of the ears as much as it does the hand. Hello, can you guys hear me? Great. I hadn't watched that in a while. But it's good because it says everything I basically wanted to say. So I can be like maybe a little bit quicker. If any of you haven't checked it out already or haven't got an opportunity, we were able to write an article for the journal this year. So that's like pretty long-winded. It has a bunch of details of what went into the project. So I don't think I can like teach anyone how to, well, I actually shouldn't. I'm not an engineer. Like this was very hobby shop together. But, you know, I'm not going to spend 5 minutes telling you exactly how it went down. But what I can do is really kind of try to share really what the video was also doing and just like what I was thinking and why we're making the decisions that we did. I mean, a lot of it had to do with necessity, especially with how we ended up building it. But, you know, the fact that, one, we didn't even have money to make it a big crew. You know, half of the budget would have been gone if we got a crane like the first day. But, you know, the access is small, and I was like, you know, how can we do this project? Like, I don't want to push it off, but I want to do an excellent job. So I just kind of like figured out different ways that we can make it happen, you know, floating the stones across on little rafts, pushing the material down into the garden rather than having it lifted over on a chute. Somehow it ended up working. But as you saw, we also filmed the whole thing because we were closed. We were going to be closed for a long while after that too, and we wanted to share what we were doing with our visitors. And you know, if they came by, they would just see like a drained pond, and it looked like a disaster zone. But you know, by shooting this video, we're able to kind of share like the process of doing it. But at the same time, it was just me and one other person building it, like essentially by hand, and then filming it. So you probably noticed like I'd be doing something, but in real life I'd do it and then like reverse it and then like set up the camera and then do it again. And it really was filmed with a cell phone. There was a little bit of drone footage that we took at the very end. But yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy. But it was also like super fun and super intimate. I was so happy that we were able to work on the project in that way. You know, there wasn't really a deadline because it was the pandemic. So I was like, I can take my time. I don't know what I'm doing, but I have the time to figure it out. I have the time to kind of manipulate stones exactly how I want that like I don't think would be possible on like a contemporary construction site. So, you know, I wouldn't recommend hiring me for anything else, but in this particular case, like it really did work out. But like truth be told, we really did get like a genuine connection to the work because we literally like bled into it. I don't think I cut myself, but we sweated a lot. And having that experience of having done it and also being the people to come maintain it, like just like in the last presentation, you know, part of preservation, part of maintenance is creating meaning. And at least for myself and Luke, we created that meaning for ourselves that we weed the hell out of this thing now because we know what it took to kind of put it together. At the same time, kind of going back to the methods, you know, I'm a young person. This is like the first time I've ever done anything even remotely like this. So, you know, not using mortar, not making anything hyper permanent was like really important to us because, you know, who am I to say I'm good enough to entomb all of these stones into this permanent place? Whereas with the way that we build it, you know, I did some amateur engineering to figure out, you know, how it's not going to fall apart. But I wanted to make sure, you know, like if something goes wrong, like I can go back and fix it one piece at a time. Once I'm old, like if this thing falls apart, like it's not going to be any more difficult than it was for me, for someone else to come and like reconfigure it if necessary. But the goal was always to make it as good as possible, to record it really well, and hopefully, you know, knock on wood, it's like inspiring enough for other people to kind of take it up. And likewise, you know, the reason that we tried so hard is because we really respect the site as a whole, the house as a whole. It has such a strong energy that we were already influenced by before we even got started. And, you know, that was like weighing on our heads. We're like, don't make this place worse. And yeah, I don't know, like, is this going? Oh, perfect, great. So I'll try to move through really quick. I wasn't even planning on saying that first part, but I can't take credit for like how I think about anything or even what I know how to do. Like anything that I know, I've learned from talking to other people, studying books, going to Japan, looking at stuff. you know, I spend a lot of time at night, like staying up and agonizing over details, but at the same time, like the details that I'm agonizing over, I only know from other people. And this picture is from a visit that was just prior to the beginning of the construction, just pre-pandemic. Dr. Tomoki Kato, who is actually the president or CEO of Ueda Kato from the last presentation, he had actually come by. Well, we invited him. I'm so grateful that he was able to come. And we didn't really talk about the Pebble Beach project that had already kind of been flushed out. We did all the research for it. But his coming prior to that project, I knew like I didn't want to start working until I really got his thoughts and his attitudes about the space as a whole, because he really is a master, and not only a technical master, but a master of understanding the meaning of a place. And really we talked about the garden, like what does it mean? What is its history? What do we hope for it to be? There's a lot of kind of specifics there, but the main kind of takeaway that we got from him, he was like, I'm not going to tell you how to do this. I'm not going to design this for you. What I can do is tell you what to think about, tell you, where your heart should be when you're working. And if you follow that, whatever work that comes out of that is going to be good. It's going to be the right work. But just like think about all the other pieces, think about the history, think about how people are going to use it, and like don't betray those things, but rather kind of enlighten them and expand them. So, after meeting with him, he says, how much time I have left? Perfect. After meeting with him, it was just like it was so refreshing, because like, I read how other gardeners speak about their gardens. You can read books about garden history. A lot of it is like very romantic. It's very passionate, and like I felt those things, but being on the outside, not being raised in like a gardening crew in Kyoto where people are talking about those things around you, at least I was careful. I was like, I don't want to be that guy that gets like drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit too deep, and really like what Dr. Kato was like, you kind of need to drink the Kool-Aid. Like if the place has to be good, it requires you really believing in it, and like it's okay. Like you've done the research, you can continue the research, and it's only going to be what you make it, and it's okay for that to happen. And like kind of sort of lightly being given those keys and like receiving them, being like, oh my God, it really set the stage for the project. So real quick, this is what it looked like before. It was a bit of a disaster zone. I'll mention real quick, why something like this would look this way at like a big public garden. But essentially, when the house was brought over from the Museum of Modern Art for it to be permanently installed in Philadelphia, the city kind of ran out of money. They basically spent it all getting the house over. But when it came time for the garden, they did what they could. Tanzai Sano was able to create a plan and to kind of get the bones started, but they had to send him home. There was probably even some bad blood that happened. City workers were able to finish it, but if they don't know how to read the plan, if they don't know just random things kind of happened. So most of the plan as it was drawn wasn't even actually installed, and the Pebble Beach was what we learned after discovering the second plan that had it on it. We're like, oh my God, this area that we kind of like, we didn't know what to do, but like I was mentioning before, like I didn't want to be, who am I to be the decision maker of what this should turn into? So finding the plan was just another one of those keys. So on the left here is actually the original, one of the plans that we discovered, or that we had, and then I've manually refurbished it. I forget the word that you would use for that. Restored it, yeah. So I kind of went in with like a magnifying glass and was able to restore the plan to kind of get a better idea of like exactly what it was supposed to be. And then here's the secondary boulder plan with the zoomed in area of where the Pebble Beach was. So just something I want to point out, I find that like at least our understanding of Suhama in the US is often kind of like generified. Oh, I have no time, this is great. I'll say something you'll notice here, unlike perhaps Sento Gosho, which is maybe one of the more famous Pebble beaches, there's a lot of boulder material drawn in on here. almost like a wild rocky coast. And that's actually another style of Pebble Beach that exists in Japan that's maybe just not always on the front page of things, but it's evoking a real landscape, a particular landscape. So that was one of the things that I initially noticed and wanted to make sure that I included in the project, rather than just making, the basic blank Pebble Beach, which in certain circumstances is exactly what you should do. But I was like, if I'm pretending to be following Tanzai Sando's plan and his idea and his spirit, like this needs to be taken into account. At the same time, as we know, like a two-dimensional drawing from above, that's not what a 3D space looks like. So at the end of the day, we had to get the materials. We unearthed them from the pond from previous iterations of the garden, probably from like 1917. And we kind of arranged them based off of the qualities of the stones that we found. Just real quick, here's the Kamo River in Kyoto. Here's an example of, like a pebble beach in Japan. This is Byodo-in. Oh, yeah. I have no time, but I'll go through this real quick. What is the history? Like, what is a suhama? That is also extremely important. I didn't want to just build this thing because, I've seen pictures of this and here's my copy of it. Like, we needed to understand, like, what are we doing? What does this mean? So, for a long part in Japanese history, these kind of pebble beaches or these shorelines really represent the kind of like taking away point into really paradise. This is like a paradise style garden. So it's kind of this idea of like, this is the junction between our world and the next world. It's like a very spiritually alive place and not just like a collection of little pebbles. And of course, Byodo-in, it's from like the 11th century. Shofuso has a different kind of basis for what we are, what kind of time periods are involved. It's a Shoin-zukuri house, which has very specific connotations. So this is actually Shofuso in the 50s in New York. This is some interior shots. This is Kojo-in, which is the building that was really the inspiration for the structure of Shofuso. And then this is their garden, which, as you'll notice, there is no Pebble Beach. So the idea was that when Shofuso was moved to Philadelphia, the footprint was much larger, and Tanzai Sano and Junzo Yoshimura, the architect, really had this grand vision of like, how do we take the concepts that are in this garden and really like expand them rather than copying them, but how do we make it on this larger scale? And this is a Horai, like paradise island style garden, so in a larger context. I have to be so done. Okay, great. Here's MoMA. This is Kanchi-in. Looking at other examples, not just going off of what I think Suhama should be, but like really digging my nails into excellent examples in Japan. So this actually seemingly is unrelated. It's a dry garden, but it has the same basic story. And if we zoom in here, you'll see that this is actually the Pebble Beach on the receiving end of Horai Mountain. Here we have Katsura Villa, which everyone is probably familiar with. On the right here, we have Sambo-in. This is actually one of a kind of courtyard garden. But you'll notice a little bit more of that like rocky style happening here. Here's Kyoto Imperial Palace, because I didn't have my camera at Sento Gosho, but it's a similar idea. These are actually taken in Maine, and the last part, I'm so sorry. The last part is really important to me because these are based off of natural landscapes. This is, if you go to a beach like this, I took these in Maine, it's a powerful feeling. And this is not even dissimilar to what we have in Japan, but visiting these places here too, like you really get that feeling, and I really feel that universality between Japan and here that really meant a lot. So this is, funny thing is, I took the pictures in Maine after the project was already completed, but then I put these side to side and I was like, whoa, Freaky Friday. So this is on the right here, this is the completed project. Once again here, same idea. This was the idea for this section, the stone arrangement was kind of this like cascading cliff face that is often seen at these shorelines where the waves are kind of crashing in and humidity's breaking off pieces. So I wanted to kind of evoke that feeling. This is what you see when you walk down the path. Feels romantic. And just some glory shots of the finished piece. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to.
Well, thank you all for soldiering on. It's been a extraordinarily rich and wonderful 3 days. My first time here at NAJGA, but I'm sure that I'm going to be back. Over the last couple days, I've learned so much about Japanese gardens, and they are so clearly part of the DNA of the global craftsman design movement. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, though. I'm going to talk about the restoration of the Hindry garden. Kelly suggests that our group might be interested in the research process into this garden's history and the identification of 2 periods of significance which shaped the form of the garden rehabilitation. Next, please.
I think you need to do it.
Where?
Here.
Great. The Hindry House is a 14-room Mission Revival craftsman house designed and built by the Heinemann brothers in 1909. This photo of the front facade, taken right after construction, shows the long, stretched-out form of the house, which takes full advantage of views to the north and the south. The house is located in Pasadena, a city built around the Arroyo Seco. For those of you that are not familiar with this place, the Rose Bowl is right in the middle of the photograph. While this part of the arroyo has been transformed into a recreational landscape, its original character was a profound influence on the craftsmen architects who worked in Pasadena. You can see a little bit of the original arroyo landscape here. The tumbled river rock and boulders are very important materials in the local craftsman vocabulary. The Hindry House is a City of Pasadena historic monument and is included as a contributing property in the National Register of Historic Places, Prospect Park Historical District. You see here the magnificent camphor trees that line Prospect Boulevard, as well as a portion of the clinker brick gates that mark the entry into the neighborhood. Here are the designers of the Hindry House, Arthur and Alfred Heinemann. Remarkably, neither had formal architectural training. The architectural historian Robert Winter describes the Heinemanns as perhaps the most successful of the amateurs working in Pasadena during the Craftsman era. And apparently, Arthur was the businessman and Alfred was the designer. The centerpiece of the house is this amazing monumental fireplace made of arroyo stone, brick, and a clock. The photo doesn't really convey the powerful impact that this fireplace has when you open the front door. It's almost confrontational in its size and its power. And in this photo, you can see how the Heinemann's version of Craftsman is materially rich, but also much lighter and brighter than many of the houses designed by their contemporaries. So I want to show you some photos of the garden as it existed when we started our project back in 2014. The landscape had been neglected for a number of years, and you can see here that the understory planting largely obscures the front of the house. And here we're looking back toward the front facade, which is also obscured by volunteer trees. Kelly McLeod's architecture firm had already started work on the building, which was extensive and included replacement of the tile roof. The eastern side of the house had been damaged by drainage problems. Water was trapped between the raised planting bed on the left and the house, causing rot inside the dining room walls. And this is a view of the naturalistic swimming pool, which was leaking. And this is a view of one of the earth mounds that we discovered had been created when the swimming pool was constructed. Those of you who know Kelly's work know that it is research-based and meticulous. She wanted to embark on a landscape restoration that would be as thorough as what was being undertaken for the house, and asked us to research the history of the landscape and to prepare a cultural landscape report. What we found is that the landscape has two periods of significance. The first period, the Hindry era, extends from 1909 to 1941, and that's the period of time when the original owners occupied the home. In this image, the house is on the right, and you can see the juvenile street trees and then the majestic mountains in the distance. Landscape historian Stephen Keelan made extensive use of aerial photographs to study the evolution of the landscape. In this photo from 1932, you can see that the house once included a formal garden on the western side of the property. These diagrams summarize the changes during the Hindry era. Key features include an open lawn in front of the house, a stand of eucalyptus trees to the north, and the configuration of the boulder-lined driveway. Hindry House has attracted some wonderful owners. The second period of significance is the Hibbs era, named for the property's third owner, Dr. Al Hibbs. He was a prominent scientist, the voice of Caltech, and he is the person who conceived of the idea of building a naturalistic swimming pool on the western edge of the property. This dapper gentleman is Cortland Paul. You can feel the joie de vivre he expressed throughout his long career. He became a landscape architect after serving in the Navy during World War II. His firm, originally Paul and Beggs, evolved into the Peridian Group. That firm designed communities, golf courses, hotels, and theme parks in Orange County and also globally. Paul interpreted Dr. Hibbs' request for a, quote, old swimming hole, in a really dramatic manner. It's a complexly shaped pool, and per Dr. Hibbs' request, it's deep enough for the family to practice their scuba diving skills. What is truly audacious about the design is Paul's use of stone. This photo, taken just after completion, shows the pool in the pool house, which was also part of Paul's work. The boulders surrounding the pool are up to 6 feet high, and they were obviously very carefully selected for their interesting texture and veining. The tiny saplings in the foreground are native riparian trees, which are clustered at the edge of the water, just as they would have been in the nearby arroyo. The addition of the swimming pool had some problematic implications for the Hindry era landscape. Paul enclosed the new pool with a fence that cut the front facade in half. I think I can use here to show you where he placed the fence, like that. A decision was also made to retain the soil from the pool excavation on site. This resulted in the mounding you saw in the existing conditions photograph, which is here and also here. This far exceeded what was shown in Paul's grading plans for the project. Having determined the two periods of significance, we were able to move forward with the inventory of the site features. The pool in the upper left is a character-defining element that needed to be restored. The boulders that line the walkways and driveway are also character-defining features. But we decided that Paul's fire feature, the middle upper photo, was not significant and could be replaced. Here in the red and green circles, I need to get a glass of water. Thank you. It's our inventory of trees to be retained and to be replaced. In terms of interpreting the planting, we were fortunate to have Paul's drawings, including this planting plan. Some of the original selections are no longer considered appropriate for the Southern California climate, and so we decided we needed to study them and find, in some cases, equivalents that would provide close spatial and textural matches to his original choices. This approach led to the development of 6 different palettes, all of which are designed to carry the garden forward for the next 100 years. And finally, we made a treatment plan describing how we were going to deal with all of the elements on the site. Having done that research, we were now ready to move forward with the rehabilitation plan. Primary character-defining features of each period of significance, the main driveway here, the swimming pool, specimen trees were all retained. Additions and changes to the garden are located outside of these character-defining areas. We added the fire feature and the spa when we removed the mounding, and we converted the problematic raised bed on this side of the house to a dry stream. This panoramic view shows the landscape after completion. From left to right, we see Paul's pool house and some of his remarkable rock work, the sycamore trees that were retained around the swimming pool, and up here, where the fence was removed, right here, you can now see Alfred Heinemann's composition, the entry of the house. All the stone lining the pathways around the house was retained in place. In lieu of the water-consumptive mown lawn, we now have low-growing cotoneaster and no-mow lawn that uses half the water. Here we're starting the walk down toward the swimming pool. You can see Cortland Paul's now mature sycamore trees, and then the pool house in the distance. And here's our first glimpse of the pool. We had to re-pour all the walkways and the steps that led to the pool so that they would slope away from the house, but all the original rock work was retained. The stone pathway above the pool is a new feature. It provides a walkway around the pool, connects to the lawn, and provides another place to appreciate the composition of the house. Here are native coral bells providing a beautiful display in the springtime. And they're mirrored in the swimming pool water. The restoration of the leaking pool was an exacting process. Following the extensive photography of the entire pool edge, All the rocks that were to be relocated were numbered so that they could be replaced back in their precise locations. Here's the fire pit that we added and this spa. The materials selected for this are complementary but distinctive from the materials used by Heinemann and by Cortland Paul. Smooth plaster on the seat and stacked stone on the fire feature and the seat wall by the spa. And some details of our planting. And this section of the talk is about the dry stream bed. I'm going to go quickly through these. This is a view of that same shot of the dining room, now repaired, and we are now able to take some of the water from the roof and direct it into the garden. And on the left, you see a decomposed granite path that encircles the dry stream and completes the circulation around the property. We had 2 stone step treads left over from our construction around the master bedroom and spa, and spontaneously decided to make a zigzag bridge over the dry stream. And I'll conclude by showing you some pictures of the garden as we get into the dusk. I think it becomes an extremely attractive destination. We asked Millicent Harvey to come back to take these photographs that capture the wonderful warm light that comes out of the windows of the house and how it affects the color of the plantings. So I love the way the moonlighting from the sycamore trees patterns the paving. These ceramic lanterns were made more than 30 years ago by a neighbor, ceramicist Stan Edmonston, and they really add to the magic of the nighttime ambiance. This project would not have been possible without our collaboration with KSMA and a highly skilled construction team. A full list of the participants can be found on our website. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share the Hindry House landscape rehabilitation.